Got it. Well, welcome again. Let me open our final gathering with a prayer titled Psalm of an Emerging Emmanuel, written by Edward Hayes. And so we pray, O come, Emmanuel. I pray with upraised eyes. Drop down, O dew of heaven, that God might walk and talk on earth, might heal and feed our sin-soaked world. O come, Emmanuel, my prayers like searchlights comb the starry winter skies. Descend from the black hole of some neighboring galaxy to green with your grace our barren earth. Such an Advent waiting prayer can be a lifelong profession of patient longing, unless I know with all my heart that Emmanuel not only comes down, but also comes forth and emerges. O come, Emmanuel, come forth from deep within me with Christmas luminous beauty, for my heart has become the sacred crib, the birthing place of Christ among us. Peace on earth and justice for all will only become manifest in our lives when enough of your sons and daughters awaken to your divine design that has made each of us an emerging Emmanuel. Amen.
Amen.
And so we come to our final time together in anticipation of your final days of prayer before Christmas. Think of how delighted God is that you've stayed faithful to your prayer throughout these weeks that I know are incredibly busy times for all of us. I titled the theme of this final week, Celebrating the Incarnation, and that has both a looking back and a looking forward aspect to it. Because when we ask what we celebrate, one answer to what we celebrate is simply the birth of Jesus. And to be sure, we want to bring ourselves back to the moment of Jesus' birth. And part of your prayer this week will include that. On day one of the week, you'll pray with the actual birth of Jesus. And on day two, the passage in which the shepherds are given the news of the birth and come to see the newborn Jesus. And how appropriate that the first people to get the news to come give glory are those among the most marginalized of their society. And I encourage you, as Ignatius does, for us to really enter into those scenes to see what God wants to reveal to you, to put yourself right in there, front and center, and engage with the activities of those passages. But birth focuses on a moment in time. When my daughter Elena was born, I didn't think about her growing up to be a singer, or about what colors she would like, or what music she would want to listen to, or what kind of books she'd want to read. I didn't think about what college she would go to, or even what her relationship with God would be like. Right? All my focus was on the baby that was. And so in celebrating the incarnation, though, we do more than focus on the birth of a baby. We rather celebrate the first step in the entirety of Jesus' life, death, and resurrection. And that puts the focus not only on the past coming of Jesus on that first Christmas, but also on his present coming in the Gospels that teach us of the life he lived, of his present coming in the sacraments, of his present coming to us in other people, and finally on his future coming in the last judgment. And your prayer on day 3 with the passage we refer to as the hymn of humility from the letter of Philippians brings home, I think, the breadth of that message. So as important as it is for us to pray with the gospel accounts of Jesus' birth, I think there's a danger of becoming too preoccupied with the nativity story. The nativity scene that we see represented, recreated in churches and town squares around the world, became popularized starting with St. Francis. In 1223, Francis sought permission from Pope Honorius III to do something, he said, for the kindling of devotion to the birth. And so it's said that Francis created that first scene, making a manger with hay and an ox and an ass in the town of Greccio. As an aside, the manger included a carved doll, which purportedly cried tears of joy and seemed to awaken from sleep when Francis awakened it. I don't know about you, I always just maybe pause a little bit at some of those stories, but hey. And while I love my own manger scene, and I lovingly lay out my creche every Advent, and I hide baby Jesus in the drawer until Christmas morning, because that's what my mother always did when we were growing up. There's a danger in thinking we do sufficient homage to this season and to the reality of incarnation by laying a baby in the manger on Christmas morning. Rather, what is asked for us is an all-out commitment to what incarnation signifies. I can't celebrate the birth of Jesus without keeping in mind his life, death, and resurrection. And it's good to remind ourselves that what our catechism calls the crowning truth of our faith is, in fact, the resurrection, which comes at the end of birth, life, and death. And critically, I also can't celebrate the birth of Christ without remembering that it asks something of me, right? We already got a hint of that in our prayer with the Annunciation this past week. If we are Christian disciples, then we are called to play an active part in birthing Christ into the world now, right? We each give reality to the rule of Emmanuel. We each, in the words of that psalm, have to become ourselves an emerging Emmanuel. And so I want to do something a little different in the time we have this morning. As we move into our last days of prayer, I invite us to consider the question, when I kneel before the creche on Christmas morning, what will I tell the Christ child about my efforts to give birth to him in my time and my culture? And you'll pray in different ways with that question in days 4 and 5 of this week. You will have your own way of answering the question, but I thought I might use our time here to jumpstart your reflection of it by sharing with you a story. And it's a story some of you may be familiar with. It's told by Henry Van Dyke, and it's titled The Story of the Other Wise Man. So you can sit back in your seats as I tell you this story and just listen. I'm going to partially tell it and partially read it. And, as another aside, this copy of the book I use, which is amazing that it's not falling apart now. It's inscribed Christmas 1968. It was a gift in that year from the two women that led the Great Books group I'm part of. And I own very few things that are this old in my life, almost nothing, but I pull this book out every Advent. It's the story about a man named Artaban. Artaban, along with his friends Caspar, Melchior, and Balthasar, searched the ancient tables that told of the coming of the star that would take them to the Anointed One. They were Magian. Artaban agreed with his friends on a place that the four of them would meet and try to travel together to find the prince who's worthy to be served. And the idea was the others were going to wait 10 days for Artaban to come before setting off. He sold his house, he sold his possessions, and he bought 3 jewels, a sapphire, a ruby, and a pearl, to carry as tribute to the king. Artaban's father and his friends mocked his plan, but he would not be persuaded. But you have to ask, if 4 of them set out, how come we only hear the story of 3 wise men, not 4 wise men? And what happened is this: Artaban left his home. He rode his horse as hard as he could to reach the appointed place to meet his friends, but something happened. While he was still 3 hours away from his friends and close to the point where they would go on without him, he passed into the shadow, and his horse there slowed and stopped before a dark object in the shadows. Artaban dismounted the horse and saw the form of a man lying in the road. He looked like one of the poor Hebrew exiles. At first, Artaban thought he was dead, but then he heard a sigh coming from the man's lips. And from the text, Artaban's heart leaped into his throat, not with fear, but with a dun resentment at the importunity of this blind delay. How could he stay here in the darkness to minister to a dying stranger? What claim had this unknown fragment of human life upon his compassion or his service? If he lingered but for an hour, he could hardly reach Borsippa at the appointed time. His companions would think he had given up the journey. They would go without him. He would lose his quest. But if he went on now, the man would surely die. If he stayed, life might be restored. His spirit throbbed and fluttered with the urgency of the crisis. Should he risk the great reward of his divine faith for the sake of a single deed of human love? Should he turn aside, if only for a moment, from the following of the star to give a cup of cold water to a poor perishing Hebrew? God of truth and purity, he prayed, direct me in the holy path, the way of wisdom which thou only knowest. Then he turned back to the sick man. Loosening the grasp of his hand, he carried him to a little mound at the foot of the palm tree. He unbound the thick folds of the turban and opened the garment above the sunken breast. He brought water from one of the small canals nearby, and he moistened the sufferer's brow and mouth. He mingled a draught of one of those simple but potent remedies, which he carried always in his girdle, for the Magians were physicians as well as astrologers, and poured it slowly between the colorless lips. Hour after hour, he labored as only a skilled healer of disease can do, and at last, the man's strength returned. After seeing the man in good care, Artaban rode as fast as he could to try to reach his friends, but by the time he arrived at the meeting place, he found a note from his friends that they had waited as long as they could, as long as possible, but they had to take off to meet the king. Well, he couldn't cross the desert alone with no food and an exhausted horse. So he did the only thing he could, which is to sell the sapphire in order to buy a camel and provisions for his journey. Alas, by the time he arrived at the place where the king should be, he couldn't find him. A young woman with her own baby told him of the strangers from the Far East who had appeared in the village 3 days ago, and how they said that a star had guided them to the place where Joseph of Nazareth was lodged with his wife and her newborn child, and how they had paid reverence to the child and given him many gifts. She told him that the travelers had disappeared, and that on the same night, Joseph took the baby and his mother off to Egypt. The young woman invited Artaban to stay for a meal. And while he was there, suddenly there came a noise of a wild confusion and uproar on the streets of the village, a shrieking and wailing of women's voices, a clangor of brazen trumpets, and a clashing of swords, and a desperate cry, the soldiers of Herod, they're killing our children. Terrified, the woman clasped her baby to her breast, praying that he would not awaken and cry. But Artaban went quickly and stood in the doorway of the house. His broad shoulders filled the portal from side to side, and the peak of his white cap all but touched the lintel. The soldiers came hurrying down the street with bloody hands and dripping swords. At the sight of the stranger in his imposing dress, they hesitated with surprise. The captain of the band approached the threshold to thrust him aside, but Artaban did not stir. His face was as calm as though he were watching the stars, and in his eyes there burned that steady radiance before which even the half-tamed hunting leopard shrinks, and the fierce bloodhound pauses in his leap. He held the soldier silently for an instant, and then said in a low voice, "I am all alone in this place, and I am waiting to give this jewel to the prudent captain who will leave me in peace." He showed the ruby, glistening in the hollow of his hand like a great drop of blood. The captain was amazed at the splendor of the gem. The pupils of his eyes expanded with desire, and the hard lines of greed wrinkled around his lips. He stretched out his hand and took the ruby. "March on," he cried to his men. "There's no child here. The house is still." The clamor and the clang of arms passed down the street as the headlong fury of the chase sweeps by the secret covert where the trembling deer is hidden. Artaban re-entered the cottage. He turned his face to the east and prayed, "God of truth, forgive my sin. I have said the thing that is not, to save the life of a child, and 2 of my gifts are gone. I have spent for man that which was meant for God. Shall I ever be worthy to see the face of the king?" Artaban continued on his journey. He wandered through Egypt. He sought everywhere for any traces he could find of the household that had come from Bethlehem. He traveled all over, everywhere, month after month, year after year. He passed through countries where famine lay heavy on the land and the poor were crying for bread. He made his dwelling in plague-stricken cities where the sick were languishing in the bitter companionship of helpless misery. He visited the oppressed and the afflicted in the gloom of subterranean prisons and the crowded wretchedness of slave markets and the weary toil of gallery ships. In all this populous and intricate world of anguish, though he found none to worship, he found many to help. He fed the hungry, clothed the naked, and healed the sick, comforted the captive. And his years went by more swiftly than a weaver's shuttle that flashes back and forth through the loom, while the web grows and the invisible pattern is completed. In all these years, Artaban never forgot his quest. He would at times take out the pearl, his one remaining gift, and look at it and wonder if he would ever see the king. 33 years passed, and Artaban was now an old man, still looking for the king. He decided during the season of Passover that he'd come one last time to the city of Jerusalem, where he had so often searched. This time, though, something was different. There was tremendous tumult and excitement. When Artaban inquired, he was told that everyone was going to Golgotha to witness the execution of Jesus of Nazareth, whom Pilate had called King of the Jews. The words King of the Jews were familiar to Artaban, and he wondered, could this be the king? Could this be the adult that was the baby that he was searching for 33 years ago? Could it be this baby had risen and been denied and was about to perish? He followed the crowds. Just beyond the guardhouse in the city and at the gate of the city, a troop of Macedonian soldiers came down the street, dragging a young girl with a torn dress and disheveled hair. As the Magian paused to look at her with compassion, she broke suddenly from the hands of her tormentors and threw herself at his feet, clasping him around the knees. She had seen his white cap and the winged circle on his breast. "Have pity on me," she cried, "and save me for the sake of the God of purity. I also am a daughter of the true religion, which is taught by the Magi. My father was a merchant of Parthia, but he is dead, and I am seized for his debt to be sold as a slave. Save me from worse than death." Artaban trembled. It was the old conflict in his soul, which had come to him in the palm grove of Babylon and the cottage in Bethlehem. The conflict between the expectation of faith and the impulse of love. Twice, the gift which he had consecrated to the worship of religion had been drawn from his hand to the service of humanity. This was the third trial, the ultimate probation, the final and irrevocable choice. Was it his great opportunity or his last temptation? He could not tell. One thing only was clear in the darkness of his mind. It was inevitable. And does not the inevitable come from God? One thing only was sure to his divided heart. To rescue this helpless girl would be a true deed of love. And is not love the light of the soul? He took the pearl from his bosom. Never had it seemed so luminous, so radiant, so full of tender living luster. He laid it in the hand of the slave. "This is thy ransom, daughter. It is the last of my treasures, which I kept for the king." As he spoke, tremors shook the earth, the stones were loosened and crashed in the street. Artaban and the girl that he had just rescued crouched beneath the wall. And Artaban realized he had no fear in him. What had he to fear? What had he to live for? He had given away the last remnant of his tribute for the king. He had parted with the last hope of finding him. The quest was over and it had failed. But even in that thought, accepted and embraced, there was peace. It was not resignation. It was not submission. It was something more profound and searching. He knew that all was well because he had done the best that he could from day to day. He had been true to the light that had been given to him. He had looked for more, and if he had not found it, if a failure was all that came out of his life, doubtless that was the best that was possible. He had not seen the revelation of life everlasting, incorruptible, and immortal, but he knew that even if he could live his earthly life over again, it would not be otherwise than it was. One more lingering pulsation of the earthquake quivered through the ground. A heavy tile shaken from the roof fell and struck the old man on the temple. He lay breathless and pale, with his gray head resting on the young girl's shoulder and the blood trickling from the wound. As she bent over him, fearing that he was dead, There came a voice through the twilight, very small and still, like music sounding from a distance, in which the notes are clear, but the words are lost. The girl turned to see if someone had spoken from the window above them, but she saw no one. Then the old man's lips began to move as if in answer, and she heard him say in the Parthian tongue, "Not so, my lord, for when saw I thee hungered and fed thee, or thirsty and gave thee drink? When saw I thee a stranger and took thee in, or naked and clothed thee? When saw I thee sick or in prison and came unto thee? 33 years I have looked for thee, but I have never seen thy face, nor ministered to thee, my king." He ceased, and the sweet voice came again. And again the maid heard it, very faintly and far away. But now it seemed as though she understood the words. "Verily I say unto thee, inasmuch as thou hast done it unto the least of these my brethren, that hast donest unto me." A calm radiance of wonder and joy lighted the pale face of Artaban like the first ray of dawn on a snowy mountain peak. One long last breath of relief exhaled gently from his lips. His journey was ended. His treasures were accepted. The other wise man had found the king. So what gift will you lay before the creche on Christmas morning, right? How, Jesus doesn't really need gold, frankincense, and myrrh from us, although I confess I was always partial to the meme that said if it had been 3 wise women, they would have brought a casserole, a warm blanket, and maybe a bottle of wine. But, what is it that each of us will do, right, to birth Christ into the world? Let me pause and just ask you for your thoughts at this point before I say anything else. Either what you just heard or what, maybe what's been going on in you as you listen to that story. And what it prompts about your own thoughts about your Christmas gifts. And remember that I believe you're muted.
Hey, Susan, what crossed my mind when you were reading the story is it's the truth. The real truth is it's not really the destination, but it's the journey. Mm-hmm. It's always true to me.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think anybody who's undertaken any pilgrimages would say that, right? I mean, I walked the Camino de Santiago, and certainly when I got there, being in the Cathedral of St. James was wonderful, but really, it's what goes on the way and the people you meet and what's happening right in your life. Yeah. I see a big smile there, Cheryl. Yeah.
I know this is off topic, but I've been wanting to walk the Camino for so long. Did you go with a group or did you do it solo?
Solo, with a friend of mine.
Oh, so awesome.
Feel free to email at some point and I'll tell you anything you want to know about it. Yeah. But I highly encourage it. I highly encourage any pilgrimage, but yeah. Yeah. Others. I guess one question is, what does it mean? What does it mean to say that what we get ready to celebrate is not just a birth, but the entirety of Jesus coming and being human among us? Yeah, make sure you unmute, Carol. You're still muted.
I guess what I thought, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
I guess what I think when you ask that question is what you also mentioned earlier. We are kind of all enamored by the creches, and I actually love to collect them, and I have a whole bunch of cool things, and my grandkids love to play with them. But that's the easy part, and that's the romantic part, and that's the sweet part. Right. It's the other part, the journey, as someone already has said, Mary, that is way harder. And I think in my own life, that's what I miss. You know, I'm so proud of my little nativity sets, but it's the walking through all that. And when you mentioned way at the beginning, all of the comings, not just this baby coming.
Yeah.
You know, we all get real sappy around babies, but they're hard too. But it certainly is living with the child through 18 or 24 years, however many, you know, years you have. Those are the hard years.
Yeah.
And it certainly is that way with this as well.
You know, and it's interesting that when we make the exercises, right, Ignatius has us pray with Jesus' childhood and Jesus. I mean, you know, if you look at the Bibles, you get the kid's born, he's presented in the temple, and then he shows up at age 12, and then he shows up again at age 30, right? And so Ignatius, you know, there was a life going on there that's going on. So Ignatius encourages us, right, to pray with that and to know that being human meant going through all the same things that we went through for his parents and for him growing up, you know. So there's a reality that goes beyond just the prettiness of the nativity scene, and we're invited to be part of all of it.
Susan, I was reminded as you were reading that wonderful story of the reflection written by Howard Thurman. Maybe many of you know it. He was a Black minister and activist. And there's a beautiful sung rendition of it. I'll put it in the chat. But I thought it's very short, but when the song of the angels is stilled, when the star in the sky is gone, when the kings and princes are home, when the shepherds are back with their flock, the work of Christmas begins. To find the lost, to heal the broken, to feed the hungry, to release the prisoner, rebuild nations, to bring peace among others, and to make music in the heart.
Beautiful. Right. Yeah, and that reminded me as you started that, Jane, of there's a T.S. Eliot poem, The Journey of the Magi. And it ends with the Magi getting back home and basically saying, you know, kind of, in sense, colloquially, what now, right? The old dispensations, the old stuff doesn't work anymore. Something's now fundamentally different. And if something's not fundamentally different, then we've kind of missed the boat. Right. And, you know, it's one of the reasons and one of the reasons I think that, well, I was going to say Ignatian spirituality, right? Christianity is challenging, but Ignatius really embraces that sense that this is not just about, I go to church every Sunday, I celebrate, you know, Christmas and Easter and the other things, you know, and give lip service to something, but, you know, but what's sought is a fundamental transformation about who we are in the world. And if you go to the first teaching Jesus gives us when he's in it, you know, I know we're jumping ahead to him being an adult already. But what his first teaching, the Sermon on the Mount, opens with the Beatitudes, right? And that's not a do X, do Y. When he talks about poverty of spirit, mercy, hunger and thirst for it, he was talking about stances out of which we live our life, right? And so that means true conversion. And so we don't just satisfy what we're meant to be by Christians by getting out in the morning and put that baby Jesus, assuming I remember to put baby Jesus in the crèche. Sometimes he stays in the drawer, and going to mass on Christmas morning. Don't laugh, Paul, you know that would be true. But it is about fundamentally transforming who we are. And that's why, you know, when we pray with these things, that's part of why Ignatius wants us to put ourselves right into these scenes from the birth all the way through the life of Jesus, because we want to let ourselves be fundamentally changed by our encounter with this person of Jesus Christ. And you all know, you've been part of an Ignatian community, right? That this sense of encounter with Christ is so foundationally important for Ignatius, because that's what changes us, right? That's what affects who we are in the world. I'm sorry, I answered a question by talking a long time when I want to hear from you. Other thoughts or action? And thank you, Jane just did put that into the chat The Work of Christmas by Howard Thurman.
Susan, what I thought of, I live in the world of young adult children, and they use an expression called FOMO, fear of missing out. I don't know if you've ever heard of FOMO.
No, I missed that one.
Okay, they talk about FOMO all the time, you know, if they miss a party or they, you know, missed an opportunity. And that's what I was thinking. This fourth Magi, he must have had serious FOMO that he missed out. But when he looked back at his life, he hadn't missed out at all. And I think of the times I have FOMO with regard to where's the Lord calling me.
Right.
And it was just a beautiful story.
Yeah, I love it for that reason, right? Because we have this sense, okay, here's what I'm supposed to be doing. And he could have, right? I mean, you know, when he asked that question, what was the temptation, right? He could have said, no, these are jewels for the king. I have to keep going and pushing on.
Right.
And that might have satisfied some narrow sense of what he thought he was supposed to be doing, but would have been counter to the love that we're asked.
Right.
Yeah.
Susan, every now and then God pops up and really shows me where I'm supposed to be and what I'm supposed to be doing. And having reflected on the Annunciation story and the call, and thinking about the things you mentioned this morning, I had a visit from my nephew yesterday, who came over to wish us Merry Christmas, but also to let us know that his wife had been diagnosed with breast cancer.
Oh, so sorry.
And so we talked about all that, and I listened and found myself standing in our living room, embracing a 40-year-old man who was just fearful and scared and frightened and worried about his wife and their future. And I felt so blessed to be there and was just really touched.
Yeah.
And this morning when I prayed, I thought it was kind of like a visitation story. You know, he came here and we shared, and I was able to offer support. And so that would be my gift.
Beautiful. Yeah. Yeah, and one of the things I think that so beautifully reminds us of is, you know, so often we think we have to look for what's this big one thing I'm supposed to do, you know, like maybe I'm supposed to find the cure for whatever, but what we're asked to do is live our life in a certain loving way of love and service, right? And that could be, you know, doing lots of small things with great love. And it's not so small to your son in that situation, right? It's everything, that kind of support. Thank you for sharing that.
I'd like to share that. So in one of Bellarmine, one of our Ignatian groups, we just did the eight weeks of the exercises. And
Wonderful.
one of the people shared that when we were praying with the incarnation, and this was a personal experience she had, the watching a bird outside, and how the bird, she could see the food, but the bird couldn't figure out the way to get it. And the idea came up in her, you know, she knew if she walked outside, the bird would fly away. But the idea came up in her, if I were a bird, I could show this bird what to do. And that just really opened up in a new way, the sense of the incarnation, you know, of God sending Jesus to be human. Like,
Right.
if I were human, I could show them, you know.
Right.
So it's
Right.
beautiful.
And that's what Jesus shows us, right? What it means to live as full humans, right? It leaves to live fully human, right? Into our image, into our creation in God's image, right? That's why, it portrays my age to say I call the week 2 grace of the exercises the Godspell grace. If you remember the song Day by Day, right? See thee more clearly, love thee more dearly, follow thee more nearly. And that's what, Jesus shows us what it means to live fully open to God's grace working in us. But what I love about this, I'm sorry, someone's just said, let me say, someone's in a place they can't unmute. But the comment is, I find it helpful to think of Advent in this light. I didn't celebrate Christmas growing up, and I've always found focus on the baby in the manger a bit disconnected from the Christian faith. What is this Advent thing? Why am I focusing on a baby? A baby can't judge us. A baby is safe. So it feels like not the full story. But thinking of Advent as the miracle of the incarnation makes more sense to me. It helps me connect Advent to Lent. Right, important, right? Because these are not disconnected parts of our faith. We have a single story, right, that runs through from creation, through birth, life, death, and resurrection. And so we're celebrating pieces, right, of a single story. And the next chat, I don't know if one of you saw it, but this is for you guys, Paul and Jane. Can this chat be saved so they can save the sites later? I guess the answer is, I don't know if the chat shows up on the recording, but Paul's shaking his head yes, so cool.
Yeah, I have a file of chats that will be downloaded.
Wonderful.
And then I can send that along to whoever desires it to be sent along. So
Oh, awesome.
I'll send a copy to Jane.
Yeah. But yeah, I do think the sense of remembering this is a single story matters to us, which does, as I said, it makes it different, right? Because when we think of ordinary birth, we're not thinking of the whole story, but since we're not going through this the first time, right? Mary gives birth to this baby. She doesn't know she's going to end up at the foot of the cross of her dying son. But we go into this year after year knowing the full story, and that has to inform how we go through it. Others? Yeah, Sarah.
Yeah, so I put a link in the chat to the 2 Feet in Love in Action that's been on the USCCB website for years now.
Yeah.
And I think if you're not aware of it already, it's a good thing to look at, because I think love expresses itself. We express love through charitable acts, but we also expressed it through works of justice. And I think that's so important in this very difficult world.
No, and I think it's an important reminder, because I think in some sense the charity part is always easier for people. I mean, I'm newly exposed to your communities there, but I have been in some church communities where people are like, well, we don't really want to talk about the justice stuff because people disagree about that and we might have arguments. So let's just focus on the charity part. But our faith includes both of those elements, right? We always say there's 2 feet of our teaching, right? The charity and the justice part. And we are called to say, how do we make a difference? And I think those are important reminders, and the reason, and part of why this is important reminder is because we may have said this, earlier on, right? When we're talking about, good people, right? Ignatius says, right, we have people, Ignatius would say there's 2 kinds of people moving from good to greater good, people moving from sin to greater sin. When you're talking about the kind of people that are doing Advent retreats and otherwise, we're not committing great sins in the world. We're not doing really bad, intentional acts that harm other people. But we do have to say, where am I failing to use, where am I failing to use my gifts to make a difference? Where do I have the ability to affect some of the unjust structures of the society where I live in and not take advantage of them? So thank you for that, Sarah. It is a good reminder for us. I can't tell, Paul, if you looked like you were saying something, but you're muted. Okay. Other thoughts, people?
I was kind of embarrassed to share this, but it's a thought that I think it returns almost every year at this time. When I was younger, my mom's favorite Christmas program, which I never liked, was The Little Drummer Boy. I never liked it growing up, but she loved it, and so we watched it. And I can't help but have this little animation come to me every year. I think about, and especially thinking about, I mean, that was like the first thing that came to mind when you asked, what gift will you like? I thought about this, and it's like this small gift that this little boy has.
Mhm.
And I think about why my mom shared it with us. It was about, gifts and that they don't have to be big. That was a big idea. And how I've tried to share that idea with my own kids without them having to watch the movie. I'd share that idea with them, but in hearing your story too, that you shared today, it forced me to think about maybe gifts that we give, whether it's being present when someone shares a diagnosis of breast cancer, whether it's just these small things that we give that we don't even realize we do, but that they're there, and that people thank us for, and that we just don't recognize those things. And maybe, I don't know, I think about that when I think about this fourth wise person who just didn't realize, didn't see those things.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, I think there's a couple things in what you say there. One is do I recognize the gifts that I have? And a lot of us were raised in the sense that, we're so concerned with making sure we're not coming off as proud, that we downplay the gifts that we have. But I can't use my gifts for God's purpose if I don't acknowledge that I have them, right? And if I keep in mind that everything I am and everything I have comes from God, then I don't get into a pride thing. So part of it is recognizing your gifts. The other thing in what you say is, right, he gave what he had, right? I give what I have, I give what I can. I'm often reminded, I share often with the law students when I'm talking with them about vocation issues. When Thurgood Marshall was retiring from the Supreme Court, he was asked by a journalist how he wanted to be remembered, or what he wanted to be remembered for. And he could have said, being the first African-American on the Supreme Court of the United States, or he could have said he wanted to be remembered for the fact that he argued Brown versus Board of Education, the Supreme Court case that led to desegregation of the schools. And his response was simply, I did the best I could with what I had. Right? I did the best I could with what I had. And that's what we're asked to do. We are gifted. Am I using those gifts to the best of my ability?
Susan, I really liked what you said. I think it was a quote from Mother Teresa, doing small things with great love.
Yeah.
Because I think we often do think, or I do, got to do something big.
That's right.
And, I really love that quote from her. So thank you for saying that today.
Yeah.
I think with regard to gifts too, that there's also, just to add one more sort of nuance on that. What do we do when our gifts are not received? Do we just pack up and go home, right? Or do we allow ourselves to keep being invited into situations where, we're really acting on the edge of our capacities, and then, have to deal with what other people give back to us? That's where we find the place of needing to trust in Christ and needing to go back to that place of discernment and be like, is this really what I'm being called to give? It's not easy. I wish that, not to change the story, but, I'm sure that there were incidents in the story of the Magi that you shared where people didn't want what he had, or they were afraid because he looked so intimidating and imposing and seemed, or they presumed that, he was intellectual or, whatever. And so they couldn't relate. And so they did not open themselves. And yet he persisted.
Yeah, I think that's a really important reminder, because the gifts will not always be received. It helps me to remember that not even everybody followed Jesus, right? I mean, not even everyone received his gifts. But we have to separate, right? My doing what I'm called to do and how it's received, right? And I need to do what I'm called, and sometimes it's going to be received and sometimes it will not be received. The other piece lingering in that, Paul, though, that I like too, is there is a discernment of, am I in fact doing what I'm called to do? And it's one of the reasons that Ignatius' teachings on discernment are so helpful to us, is exactly that, right? So it may be that the non-receipt is simply someone else's non-receipt. It may be a signal that maybe I'm not doing the right thing. So yeah, no, there was an old, not very good movie back in the 60s with Burt Reynolds and Kurt Christopherson, football movie, and the name of it was Semi-Tough. And the tagline that kept getting repeated was, nobody ever, they were in a Texas accent that I can't imitate. No one ever said it weren't going to be semi-tough. And I always think about that in this context, because Jesus certainly never said it was going to be easy. And it is hard, because we are in this continual discernment. But do I have the trust that God is with me through it? See, so all of this comes just out of praying with the incarnation, because it's not just a moment in time. It's the beginning of everything, for us. Any of the comments in the chat? I don't think so. I think we got it. Just let me make a couple of final comments, since I won't get to see you again, at least in this format. I really encourage you to spend time at the end of the retreat gathering the graces of the retreat experience. My own view is that any retreat experience, regardless of its length, is deepened by taking some time engaging in a process that helps appropriate the experience, because otherwise we receive graces and they just kind of flitter through our consciousness. And so you'll notice that the last day of prayer this week, whenever that is for you, because you may take extra days praying with these incarnation events through Christmas, but just goes through some questions you might consider as you pull together the graces of the retreat. And I often recommend to people to do that kind of exercise immediately at the end of the retreat, and then maybe a week or so later, because we know that the graces of a retreat experience continue to unfold over time. And I can't remember now if we talked about repetition, but as you're going through this process, to really, think about some of the prayer experiences you've had that have been really powerful to you, and go back to them and see what else God might want to reveal. Because even though we finish Christmas celebration on Christmas, we still have this Christmas season afterwards. And so, to continue doing prayer, one of the nice things about doing this kind of retreat and daily living is, if you had kind of slacked off a little bit on your daily prayer beforehand, hopefully 4 weeks of this kind of intentional prayer gets you back on a good, solid, commitment to keeping with it. And so I would encourage sticking with some of this material afterwards. Any other questions about any of what we've done? Someone asked, can I email? Yeah, feel free. You should have my email, because it's on whatever email you got with the links. And if not, I'm easy to find. It's sjstabile@stthomas.edu. I can put that in if I can figure out how to talk at the end and type at the same time. Yeah, I can put my email. Okay. Anyway, any other questions or final comments? Right, then let me just
gratitude. Excuse me, Susan.
Yeah, sure.
I'm going to express gratitude from everyone here on the screen, anybody who's come to any of these Saturday morning sessions, and all of the people who've been praying this retreat. There has been such appreciation and gratitude for you and the quality of it, and just lots of superlatives. But just really thank you for giving us an Advent that I think has been quite unique for each one of us because of your immersion in it, you immersing us into these stories and into the spirituality. So thank you. And we look forward to seeing you in January.
Yeah. Thank you, Jane. Let me just end again with the last two stanzas of the prayer I opened with. O come, Emmanuel, come forth from deep within me with Christmas luminous beauty. For my heart has become the sacred crib, the birthing place of God among us. Peace on earth and justice for all will only become manifest in our lives when enough of your sons and daughters awaken to your divine design that has made each of us an emerging Emmanuel. Amen. And blessings to all of you on these last days of Advent. Don't slack off. You still got another week of prayer here. And have a really blessed and wonderful Christmas, everyone. Thank you all. Thanks. Any final word from our sponsor there, Paul?